Hi, everyone. Welcome to our lecture on measuring sustainability. Your textbook talks about lots of different ways to measure sustainability. For this lecture, I'm going to mostly focus on two things. First, just kind of a general understanding of like how do we value nature in the first place? So when we think about measuring environmental sustainability, right, we want to think about how we value that nature. And the second is that I'm going to focus on is the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which are these global goals and metrics in which to evaluate sustainable development. But we're going to start with, again, how do we value nature? And so a lot of the ways in which we value nature are actually connected to our ethics. Ethics is the study of good and bad and right and wrong. And they are different than morals. Morals are kind of like these inner things that guide you. But different cultures and worldviews lead to different values, and they lead to different right or wrong actions. So that's what ethics is. So what does ethics have to do with sustainability in the environment? Um, Environmental ethics is the application of ethical standards to relationships between human and non-human entities. So we can think about, in its very simplistic terms, if we're to think about problems, and these are going to be very simplistic, but should we conserve resources for future generations? Is it okay to destroy a forest to create jobs for people? Should we drive other species to extinction? Is it okay for some communities to be exposed to excess pollution? Right? Depending upon our background and our culture and how we were raised, we might come to different conclusions about this. And there are different environmental ethical perspectives. We want to think about them as different perspectives as opposed to someone is unethical or ethical, right? That's kind of a dichotomy that I'm not talking about here. But there are kind of three main ethical perspectives with concerns to environmentalism. The first is anthropocentrism, which is only humans have rights. Right? The costs and benefits are measured only by their impact on people. Anything not providing benefits to people has no value. So if we want to think back to when we were talking about environmental history last week, kind of Europeans coming over to the Americas and looking at nature and being like, okay, exactly how can we use this for us? It was put here for us. How are we getting the most value out of it? Next is biocentrism, where certain living things have value. All life, human and non-human, has some ethical standing, and generally opposing development that destroys life, even if it creates jobs, right? So things have a right to exist, both human and non-human entities, right? And we do not want to do anything to destroy that life, even if it's good for our economy. And then lastly is ecocentrism, which is whole ecological systems have value. Values of the well-being of species, community, and ecosystems. It is holistic. It preserves connections between entities. So it's not just looking at the polar bears deserve to be alive, and we want to make sure not to destroy polar bear habitat, but kind of looking at whole ecological systems instead. And in reality, these all overlap, right? Everybody or most people have some piece of each of these, right? When you think about biocentrism, right? Some species have more value than others. And for most people, this is true, right? We tend to hold our pets kind of in higher regard than we do a cockroach. I just want to kind of review, we talked about last week about the preservation ethic versus the conservation ethic as well. So remember, John Muir, who's pictured on the left with Teddy Roosevelt, he was all about preservation, preserving things in their pristine way, not for human use. Nature has its own intrinsic value. Versus Gifford Pinchot, he was a conservationist. He wanted to utilize nature to benefit the most people. And so we think about, how do you value nature, right? Environmental ethics differ among people. Some people see things as having an intrinsic value. People, organism, objects are valued inherently, right? It doesn't have to be of use to you as an as opposed to an instrumental value, things valued as a means to something else. And very often when we're talking about conservation or preservation for that matter, um, a lot of people have trouble with kind of wrapping their mind around preserving species that don't really have any meaning to them, right? If we think about something like fairy shrimp in San Diego County, these are these very, very tiny shrimp that live in something called vernal pools, which are these kind of almost like little depressions in the ground where water is only there in the spring. And this is one of the only places that we live. So it kind of prevents development because we need to protect these fairy shrimp. And people are like, why are we protecting these tiny little things that nobody uses? So we want to think about some of these things going forward, especially when we talk about different ways we're trying to make different spaces and places and industries sustainable. How are we valuing the pieces of that? One of the ways that people try to achieve sustainability is through something called payment for ecosystem services. You're going to watch a short YouTube video that's going to go into it a little bit more in depth. But basically, the idea between payment for ecosystem services or any type of market value system where you're using ecosystem services is basically, I talked about ecosystem services in the last lecture or the lecture before, where nature provides us with things like clean air, clean drinking water. It recycles our nutrients. And so putting a market value on that, a financial dollar amount on that, and then paying people to conserve that. So that little video that you're going to watch is going to give you an example of that. But so how do we measure sustainability? So we're talking about measuring kind of the value of the environment. But one of the first ways we want to measure sustainability is we want to avoid greenwashing. What greenwashing is when you take a product and you market it as sustainable, although it is not actually sustainable, or there are no metrics to determine whether or not it's sustainable. I gave Rubio's as an example a while back, and I'm not saying that their shrimp is or is not sustainable, but we don't really know what that means. Is that environmental sustainability, economic sustainability, social sustainability? We see things that are marketed as sustainably produced all the time. And so we want to provide specific goals and or benchmarks in which to understand why or how something that is sustainable that can be evaluated or verified by outside parties. So ideally, when you slap sustainability on something, you are having some type of evaluation process and some level of metrics. This is important because the exercise that you're going to do in this chapter is going to, or in this module rather, you are going to have to kind of provide some goals or benchmarks for sustainability. And they should be comparable within industries or practices, right? We don't want every coffee producer out there to have their own metrics of sustainable production. And they need to be continually evaluated, right? We do not want one metric to stay. We want industries to be evaluated all the time, those metrics to be adjusted depending upon what's happening globally. So there are two components to this. One is a goal. What is it that we want to accomplish? And the second is an indicator. How do we know that we're accomplishing our goal? So I'm going to give you a lot of examples of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals because they are really good at providing the what, and then how do we evaluate that? Like, what is the goal and how do we evaluate that? And so this is something that we're going to want to think about continually moving forward in this class. It's something you're going to want to think about for your final project. It's something that you're going to want to think about for your group projects. Not for your group projects, sorry, for your exercises. In the in-person class, it's group projects. It's not group projects for you guys. The United Nations originally had the Millennium Development Goals. There were 8 of them. And they were to eradicate extreme poverty and hunger, achieve universal primary education, promote gender equality and power among women, reduce child mortality, improve maternal health, combat HIV, AIDS, malaria, and other diseases, ensure environmental sustainability, and create a global partnership for development. And they fell short. in these goals, right? So this was the millennium, the year 2000. And you're going to watch a short news clip from Al Jazeera that talks about how those goals fell short. That's from a few years ago. But since then, they have come up with sustainable development goals. So they've expanded upon it. And now they have 17 of them. They've refined them. And so we're going to go through what these 17 goals are. There's going to be a lot of text on the slide. I am not going to ask you on an exam like I might ask you for examples, but I'm not going to ask you to name the 17. So don't get caught in the weeds here. I just want us to go, I'm telling you these so that we really have a clear idea of like what is a goal and what is an indicator. So first is no poverty, right? Eradicate all poverty. Poverty is currently measured as people living on less than $1.25 a day, which is certainly not enough to live on in the United States. But by 2030, these goals are. And so the indicator there is the proportion of the population below the international poverty line by sex, age, employment status, and geographical location, urban versus rural, right? So this goal, no poverty. What does no poverty mean, right? It means we need to have a specific proportion of the population that is not living below the global poverty status. The next is no hunger, right? And so they want to ensure that all people, in particular the poor and people in vulnerable situations, including infants, have access to safe and nutritious and sufficient food all year. So what does hunger mean, right? We need to have enough food, we need to have nutritious food. And when you look at the indicator, the prevalence of undernourishment, of moderate or severe food insecurity in a population based upon food insecurity experience scale. So that means that they have made this goal, but then they have developed this very specific scale. You can download this book and there would be a lot more on this. Good health and well-being, right? Reduce maternal mortality ratio to less than 70 per 100,000 live births, right? So here is, when you think about the goal of good health and well-being, here is one of the metrics for that, looking at maternal health. And there are more of them. I'm not going to go through all of those, but quality education, proportion of young people in grades 2 and 3 that have a minimum proficiency level in reading and mathematics by sex. So again, thinking about gender, so a specific indicator for gender equality. I'm going to skip ahead to number 7. I'm not going to go through all of them, but affordable and clean energy, something we're very concerned about in a class of sustainability. We want to have universal access to affordable, reliable, and modern energy services. What does that mean? We need a proportion of the population with access to electricity, a proportion of the population with primary reliance on clean fuels and technology, right? So what does it mean to have universal, right? You need to have a specific proportion. Sustainable cities and communities. We want a proportion of urban population to fall that's living in slums, informal settlements, or in adequate housing. There are other indicators based upon this as well, but one of them being that we want to make sure that people are no longer living in informal settlements, which is another word for slum. So basically, if I was to run through all of these, we would see that they cover different aspects of the economy, the environment, and social. That triple bottom line that I talked about in the beginning of the course. What you are going to do for your next exercise, and I'm giving you a very short lecture this week because I would like you to commit some time to this. I don't want you to do it at the last minute, kind of, written in blue pen and a picture taken on your phone. I am going to grade these based upon the effort that you have put into them. But this is a conceptual model for the triple bottom line, right? Environmental,